Hi everyone, welcome to Simeon Cloud. My name is Dawit, and in this video, we will be doing a basic overview of Simeon Cloud. So let's sign in. This is assuming that you already have access to the Simeon Cloud app, but if you do not, please contact support@simeoncloud.com and we'd be happy to help you. So let's get on with it. This is the install page, and I'll be showing you how to install your first tenant. But first, we need to install a baseline tenant. A baseline tenant is a tenant that will house or have your best practice configurations. And to install a tenant, we need to get the tenant domain name. I already have that prepared, so I'll enter it in the first box that you see here. Now, I want to customize the display name so that it's easier to know that it's a baseline. So I'm going to add the phrase baseline at the beginning. Here, we have the option of applying the Simeon baseline configurations to the tenant. If I toggle it on, it will show me a warning telling me it will wipe out existing configurations, but I don't want to do that. I am coming in with my own configurations, so I'm not going to apply the Simeon baseline to it. So I'm going to turn that off. And then under advanced settings, these are the authentication methods. The first one, which is the default one, is delegated authentication. When you install a tenant with this option on, you are granting Simeon a refresh token or a catch sign-in for an existing user in the tenant that is a global admin or with a user with these permissions. Here, if you go to the Simeon Cloud website, you'll be able to access our documentation here. And I'm going to go to our docs, and then here are the permissions if you don't want to use a global admin for your user. Now let's get back to the Simeon app. The benefit of using delegated authentication is that you can protect the user behind MFA and conditional access policies. The downside is if you make changes to MFA or conditional access policies, that can invalidate the refresh token or the catch sign-in. And if that ever happens, you would have to re-authenticate. We generally recommend the delegated authentication option for downstream tenants or child tenants. The second authentication method is the service account. With the service account, the Simeon app will create a new Azure AD user in the tenant called Simeon at the tenant domain name. This user will be a non-interactive global admin. Since it's not interactive, it cannot complete MFA requests. As a result, you have to exclude the service account from MFA policies for this to work consistently. In general, we recommend the service account for baselines or when you have more than 20 tenants. The third authentication method listed here is the service principal. With the service principal, instead of syncing your tenant configurations through a user like delegated authentication or service account, it would be syncing through the Simeon sync service principal that will be added in the tenant. Currently, the service principal is not a standalone authentication method because it does not support all the configurations we manage syncing. It mostly supports MS Graph policies at the moment. If you want to see the configurations that we support syncing, you can go to our docs and you can go to the Manage Configurations section, and they are listed out here. So let's install this tenant. I'm going to add the service principal option on top of the service account. You can do that if you want with delegated authentication as well. So let's install this. It will give us a pop-up telling us to sign in with the global admin in the tenant so that it can create the service account and the service principal. I'm going to click yes. And then I'm going to sign in and grant it the permissions for the installer to install Simeon onto the tenant. Here, it gives us the option of selecting an Azure subscription if we want to sync configurations that do need it, like resource groups. If you don't have one at the moment, that is fine. You can go ahead and click OK. And then in the future, if you want to pick up a subscription that you've added, you can reinstall the tenant and select that subscription. But for now, we're just going to click OK. The tenant has finished installing. So now we're going to sync the tenant. When we sync the tenant, it will take us to the sync page. The sync is basically going to go into the tenant and take a backup of the existing configurations. This is because we are not applying the Simeon baseline to the tenant. If you are applying the Simeon baseline to the tenant, it will deploy changes to your tenant. But in this case, it's not, since we're not applying the Simeon baseline. If you're curious to see what the sync is doing, you can actually click on the green status here, and it will take you to the pipeline in DevOps. And you can click preview here, and it will show you the logs of what the sync is doing. Now we're just going to wait for this to finish syncing, and we're going to install our second tenant. Our second tenant will be a child tenant or a downstream tenant of this baseline. The baseline has finished syncing. Let's take a look at what it has exported or taken a backup of. You can click on the arrow on the left side of the checkbox and it will expand. And we have an export tab, which means a backup. And we have our first sync log. Let's click on that. And you can scroll down to see what it has pulled in. All right, now let's install our second tenant. Let's go to the install page. As you can see now, we have a baseline now here, auto selected. If you have multiple baselines, you'll be able to select which baseline that child tenant or downstream tenant will be pointing to when you install it. Now, let's get the tenant domain name of that downstream tenant. I'm going to enter the tenant domain name of the tenant that will be a downstream tenant. A downstream tenant is, in your case, what's going to be a client tenant. For this tenant, I'm going to go with the delegated authentication method because I want you to see the difference between the service account and delegated authentication steps for authenticating or installing the tenant. I'm going to click install and then log in with a global admin in that tenant. For each tenant that you install in Simeon, you would have to use a global admin from that tenant. Same step here. I don't have an Azure subscription, so I'm just going to click OK. Since I have installed this tenant in Simeon before with the service account method, this installer has detected there was a service account in the tenant and is asking if I would like to remove that. I don't want to do that, so I'm going to click no, but you can go with yes. If it's the first time that you've installed that tenant, it is more likely that it will not ask you or give you this option. So let's now sync this tenant. Whenever you install a tenant with delegated authentication, it will also require you to authenticate on the sync page for this tenant's sync. So we're going to click OK and go there. So the status of this tenant sync will change to pending authentication when it's ready for you to authenticate. That pending authentication window is for 5 minutes, so please keep an eye on it. When it's going to say pending authentication, we're going to click on it and complete the steps on the screen. The sync is now ready for us to authenticate, so let's do it. I'm going to click on it. It's going to take me through the steps. Click continue, copy the code, click login, paste the code, and log in with the global admin of that tenant. And you can see which APIs is trying to access. And I'm going to click continue. So this is the first code. There will be 2 more codes, and in total, 3 codes. Second code, repeat the same steps. This time, a different API. This should be the last one. Also a different API. You can wait for this to say finish, but I'm just going to click close here. We are now waiting for the sync to finish. The downstream tenant sync has finished syncing. Keep in mind that the first sync of a downstream tenant only takes a backup, so it does not apply the configurations from your baseline tenant to the downstream tenant. Now let's take a look at the Reconcile page since both of our tenants are ready. Here, I'm going to select the downstream tenant. Whenever you select a downstream tenant, by default, Simeon will compare that downstream tenant against its baseline. And when it's comparing them, it will categorize the configurations in the 2 tenants across the 4 sections that you see here. The first section is the only in section. If you hover over it, it will show you a tooltip indicating what is showing you under that section. The configurations under the only in section are configurations that are unique to the downstream tenant or the tenant you selected here, and they do not exist in the other tenant, in this case the baseline. So these configurations are unique to the tenant. If you want to take a look at these configurations, you can click on the arrow of the category, and the configurations of that type will show under there. And you can see the count of those configurations here. If you want to see the contents, you can click here. On the left is the property, on the right is the value. The main action that you can take in the only in section is using the checkboxes on the left side of a configuration. You can uncheck to remove the configuration. Now, let's try to do that. When you uncheck a configuration, and if there is another configuration that depends on it, you'll see this warning, because if you remove the group, you'll also remove the other configuration that depends on it. If you want that, you can click yes. And if you want to make this change, you have to click Reconcile. When you click Reconcile, it will show you a summary of what will happen if you click the Reconcile button here. If you click Reconcile here, it will make this change to this tenant's repository in DevOps. And then if you run a sync, it will pick up those changes and it will wait for your approval to deploy them. If you approve, it will remove the group and the conditional access policy. I want to show you how that works. So I'm actually going to click Reconcile. You have the option to sync now and deploy those changes, or you could sync later. If you forget to sync, we have the daily automatic syncs that run at 6 a.m. GMT that will pick the change you've made and they will wait for your approval. Nothing gets deployed to any of your tenants without you approving in Simeon. So right now, I'm going to sync later. If you've noticed, the count has gone down because we removed a configuration. Now, if you want to, let's just say, clear the selection you've done, you can click the reset button. Reset will put the checkboxes back to their default state. In this case, for the only in section, it will check them back. Now if I click reconcile, there are no changes to make because I've reset. Now let's move on to the available section. Under this section, you'll see configurations that exist in the baseline, but they do not exist in the downstream tenant. If you want to add them, all you have to do is select on a checkbox of the configuration you want to deploy. You might see a notification at the bottom telling you it added a dependent configuration. In this case, this conditional access policy depends on a group, so it auto-selected that. If you scroll up, you'll see that the group is auto-selected. So Simeon preserves dependencies for you. Now I'm ready to make this change, so I'm going to click reconcile. And again, it shows you a summary of what is going to happen. In this case, it's adding these configurations. So I'm going to click reconcile. I'm also going to sync later because I'm going to make multiple changes and I want to sync them all at once. Now, if you've noticed, the configuration we added earlier is not showing in this section anymore. That's because by adding that configuration, we're making it match the baseline. So it has moved to the matching section. We're going to take a look at that later. But for now, let's move on to the conflicting section. Under this section, you'll see configurations that exist both in the downstream tenant and the baseline. But there's a difference in how they're configured. So let's take a look. If you click view, you'll be able to see the conflict. So for this configuration, all the conflicting properties will show up at the top. On the left will be the property, and on the right will be two columns to show you the value for that property of that configuration in each tenant. And if you scroll all the way down, you'll see the rest that are matching because they don't have two columns for their values. Now, if you want to make this configuration match the baseline, you can use the buttons on the left to toggle your values so that you can use the value from the baseline. In this case, I only want to make a change to one property and I'm going to leave the rest as conflicting. However, you can toggle all properties to use from the baseline so that they match completely. But I don't want to do that as I only want to make one change. And then I can click reconcile. I'm also going to sync later. In this case, now if I go back, that property that I changed is now showing as matching with the baseline for this property since there's only one value. If you resolve all the conflicts, the whole configuration will move to the matching section. If you'd like to make a configuration match completely the baseline, under the conflicting section, you can uncheck the configuration, and that basically makes it toggle each conflicting value to use from the baseline. But I'm going to check it back. Keep in mind, however, all the changes that I've been making so far is to the tenant's repository and not directly to the tenant. You will have to sync to deploy those changes to the tenant, and you will also have to approve once the sync is ready. If you do not approve, no changes will be deployed to the tenant. You might have also noticed that there's a warning at the top. You'll see this warning every time the baseline repository or the downstream tenant repository has been updated and the tenant has not been synced yet. Now let's move on to the matching section. In the matching section, you'll see configurations that exist in both tenants. They're of the same type and name and they match completely. Most of the configurations in this section are default configurations because initially most tenants match for these configurations, as these default configurations are not deletable and they exist in all tenants. And you can notice that some of these checkboxes are grayed out. So these checkboxes indicate that you cannot use Simeon to delete the configuration. If you want to make changes to the configuration, you can click on that configuration name, click View in Portal, and then sign into the tenant and make changes to that configuration. So I want to demonstrate removing a configuration for you. For example, in this case, this configuration guest user has another configuration that depends on it, and this other configuration cannot be deleted, so I won't be able to uncheck it. Let's try this. All right. I'm going to make this change. I'm going to sync later. All right. Now if we go to the matching section, that configuration is no longer here and it has moved back to the available section. And then for the configuration or the conditional access policy that we added earlier from the available section, it will show here. And its dependency that got added with it together will be showing under groups here. So this is pretty much the 4 sections. The other main feature in here is search. In search, you'll be able to search configuration types, configuration directories, property names, and property values. So if I want to look for conditional access policies, I'll type in conditional access, and you can see all the conditional access terms being highlighted. You can see that it also highlights it in the property values. So search is very powerful as it helps you quickly navigate to the configuration you're looking for. And you can even make changes in this section. You can reconcile. Now, I've made some changes, so I want to sync them. So let's go to the sync page. So this is the downstream tenant, and I'm going to kick off a manual sync. All right, we're going to wait for the sync to say pending approval, and then we're going to take a look at what it's going to deploy. The sync is now ready for us to approve. So let's take a look. When you click on the pending approval button, it will expand to show you a summary of what will happen. It looks like it's making the expected changes for the conditional access policy in the removed groups, but it skipped the authentication strength because it does not support delete. So as a result, the sync will skip it. In this case, I'm okay with these changes, so I can approve. But you can also reject, and if you reject, it will just cancel the sync, but the changes you've made to the repository are still there. So the next time the sync runs, either on a manual sync or on the daily automatic syncs, it will pend approval again. The third option is to reject and revert. This will cancel the current sync and will run another one to clear these pending changes. And then you can later on add them back if you like. In this case, I want to deploy these changes, so I'm going to approve. It shows me a summary of what will happen, and I can make a comment. I'll say first deploy. approve. It gives me another warning since it's removing configurations. Now I will confirm since I'm okay with this. All right, we have approved Z sync, and now it will make those changes to the tenant. The downstream tenant sync has finished deploying. So if we want to take a look at the deploy logs, we can expand the arrow and we'll have our first deploy log. You can click on it and you can see that it was successful. That's it for today, guys, and thank you for watching.